sun peeked through thick clouds over the emerald canopy of the Colombian rainforest. Trees stood like tall sentinels, their leaves whispering with the wind. Below, the ground was soft with mud and fallen leaves. In this remote part of the world, the air was filled with the hum of insects, birds calling in distant trees, and the sound of quiet footsteps on the narrow path. 3 people walked beside their indigenous hosts, listening, learning, and offering help. Terence Freitas walked ahead, carrying a journal in his worn backpack. Ingrid Washinawatok walked steadily beside him, calm and focused. Lahe'ena'e Gay followed close, watching the forest around them. Each of them came from a different place, but all shared the same mission, to support the UWA people, an indigenous community fighting to protect their land and way of life. The UWA territory was peaceful, yet tense. The people lived close to nature. They fished in clear rivers and grew food in gardens surrounded by wild plants. Their homes were made of wood and palm leaves. Smoke from morning fires rose into the sky like signals. But not far away, helicopters sometimes passed overhead. Trucks came and went. And the sound of machines drilling into the earth disturbed the silence. These machines were not from the UWA. They belonged to oil companies. For the UWA, the land was sacred. It was not just a place to live, but part of their identity, their spirit, their history. But oil companies saw something else: profit. They wanted to explore, drill, and extract what lay hidden under the soil. The UWA had said no. Again and again. But the pressure kept coming. And with it, danger. Terence, Ingrid, and Lahe'ena'e were not strangers to danger. They knew their work brought risks. Terence had written about it in his journal. He had seen the tension building. Soldiers, guerrillas, and strangers with questions all moved through the region. The line between friends and threats was often unclear. Still, the 3 stayed. They believed their presence could help protect the UWA. They believed in peace, in human rights, in solidarity. That February morning in 1999, the group prepared to leave the territory. Their work for now was done. They had spoken with community leaders, shared ideas, and collected stories. They said goodbye with hugs and quiet words. They didn't know it would be the last time. The road out was narrow, muddy, and lined with thick trees. A vehicle waited to take them back toward the city. But they never reached their destination. Somewhere on that road, masked men appeared. The group was taken quietly, without warning. There was no sound of gunfire, no chase, just a sudden silence. Then, they were gone. Days passed. The UWA were worried. They had trusted these visitors. Now, they were missing. News traveled slowly through the mountains and forests. Families in the United States and Hawaii waited by phones. Letters were sent. Questions asked. But no answers came. 8 days later, a farmer near the Venezuelan border found something strange in his cow field. 3 bodies, lying still in the wet grass. Rain fell softly, soaking the earth. The bodies were tied. Their faces covered. There were signs of violence. It was clear they were the same 3 who had entered the UWA territory in peace. The news shocked the world. 3 people: land defenders, helpers, peacemakers, gone. Taken in silence, found in silence. Governments responded. There were press conferences, investigations, reports. But the truth stayed cloudy. Who was responsible? Why were they taken? What message did this send? In Colombia, the conflict had many sides. Guerrilla groups, like the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, known as FARC, were active in the region. Some said FARC was behind the act. But others asked why. These were not enemies. These were people helping a peaceful community. Still, the answers didn't come. Back in the United States, Abby Reyes, Terence's partner, was left with grief, confusion, and a box of unanswered questions. She tried to understand. Tried to gather pieces. His writings. His letters. His words. And a letter he had never sent, a letter found years later in his journal. In that letter, Terence wrote of worry. He had sensed something changing. He believed that some in the guerrilla group had begun to support oil development. That scared him. He feared that their presence supporting the UWA had become dangerous. Years turned into decades. Families waited for justice. But justice moved slowly. In 2019, 20 years after the loss, a letter came. It invited the families into Colombia's transitional justice process. It was part of Case 001, focused on thousands of kidnappings during the Civil War. The letter asked them to share their stories, their questions, their truth demands. For Abby, it was the beginning of something new. Not a solution. Not closure. But a chance to speak, to be heard. She began writing a memoir called Truth Demands. She returned to old boxes, to old memories. She reread Terence's words. And she found herself remembering not just pain, but strength. Terence had written that he felt safe with Abby. That writing helped him rest. Now, she wrote to find her own rest. The act of writing became her way of healing. Her way of sharing the burden of memory. Her way of making sense of what had happened. The forest still stands. The UWA still live on their land. But the noise of industry has not gone away. Oil is still seen as valuable. And indigenous rights are still at risk. But the story of Terence, Ingrid, and Lahe'ena'e reminds us that quiet courage matters. That even in loss, voices can rise. That silence can carry truth. Their story became more than a memory. It became a call. A call for justice. For peace. For the right to defend land without fear. Their lives were short, but their impact was long. And through voices like Abby's, they continue to speak. Sometimes, justice does not arrive quickly. Sometimes, answers never come. But even then, the telling of the story matters. The remembering matters. The quiet fight continues not with anger, but with love. Not with weapons, but with words. And in the heart of the rainforest, their footsteps are still heard in the wind. In the early months of 1999, 3 people made a journey not for adventure, not for money, but for something far deeper. For peace. For justice. For a voice long silenced by powerful forces. They flew to the heart of Colombia, a land both beautiful and troubled. A land rich in nature, and rich in conflict. They were invited by the UWA people, an indigenous community living high in the cloud forests of northeast Colombia. The UWA believed that the land was sacred. The trees, the rivers, the animals, everything was part of a great spiritual balance. But outside forces were pushing into their home. Oil companies, backed by global money and power, wanted to drill on UWA territory. The community was afraid, not only for the land, but for their culture, their children, their future. So the UWA reached out for help. And help came. Terence Freitas was just 24. A young man from Los Angeles. He wasn't loud or showy. He was calm, focused, and deeply committed to his work. He had studied environmental science. But more than books, it was people that moved him. He had spent time with the UWA before, walking their trails, listening to their elders, learning their ways. He was known for his gentle spirit. He often carried a journal, where he wrote down thoughts about justice, land, and responsibility. He believed the rainforest was not just a place but a living, breathing being that needed to be protected. He had dark curly hair, a kind smile, and eyes that always seemed to be searching for understanding. Ingrid Washinawatok Elisa was different, older, more experienced. She came from the Menominee Nation in Wisconsin. A woman of strength, deeply connected to her roots. She had spent years fighting for indigenous rights not just in the U.S., but around the world. She served as the director of the Fund for the Four Directions, an organization dedicated to indigenous education and self-determination. She wore long skirts and traditional jewelry. When she spoke, people listened. Not because she was loud, but because she carried the weight of generations in her voice. She believed that culture could not survive without language, without memory, without pride. For Ingrid, protecting the UWA was not charity, it was kinship. Lahe'ena'e Gay completed the trio. She was native Hawaiian, and the founder of Pacific Cultural Conservancy International. She had a presence that lit up a room. Proud, fierce, intelligent. She believed indigenous people should lead their own futures, and her life's work was helping them do exactly that. She had a background in communication, diplomacy, and activism. She knew how to listen, but she also knew how to speak to power. Her heart, like Terence's and Ingrid's, was tied to the land. And to the people who called it home. The journey to the UWA land was not easy. From Bogota, they took a small plane to a remote town. From there, the road turned to dirt. The wheels kicked up dust as they drove past green hills and grazing cattle. Eventually, the roads disappeared altogether. They continued on foot, crossing narrow wooden bridges, hiking steep paths, wading through clear, cold rivers. The rainforest grew thick around them. Sounds filled the air, birds calling, insects buzzing, leaves rustling in the wind. There were no fences. No walls. Just forest and sky. When they reached the UWA village, it was late afternoon. The sun was low, casting golden light through the trees. Smoke curled from clay chimneys. Children peeked from behind doorways. And then, the drums began. The UWA held a welcome ceremony. It was simple, but powerful. The elders gathered in a circle. They offered words in their native language, words of thanks and hope. Flowers were laid at the feet of the guests. Women sang. Men played flutes carved from bamboo. The air smelled of wood smoke and sweet leaves. It was a sacred moment. One that stitched the visitors into the fabric of the community. The work began immediately. Terence, Ingrid, and Lahe'ena'e sat with the elders to discuss the new school. The UWA wanted education, but not the kind forced on them by outsiders. They wanted a school that taught UWA children their language, their stories, their way of life. A school that honored both tradition and survival in a changing world. Terence helped plan the curriculum, how to blend science with spirit, history with hope. Ingrid listened to the stories of UWA women and shared lessons from her own people. Lahe'ena'e worked on ways to connect the UWA's voice with the outside world, to gain support and solidarity. They did not stay in hotels. They lived with families, sleeping in hammocks, eating cassava, plantains, and fish caught fresh from the river. At night, they sat by the fire, listening to the old stories. Stories of the white foam woman, of the jaguar spirit, of the mountain that breathes. They weren't just guests anymore. They had become part of something. But shadows hung over the village. Far away, oil companies were still making plans. Roads were being built nearby. Maps were drawn, not by the UWA, but by strangers in distant offices. Helicopters sometimes passed overhead. Armed groups moved through the forest. The UWA were not alone in feeling threatened. Colombia, at that time, was in the middle of a long and painful conflict. Armed groups, some claiming to fight for the people, others simply for power, operated in rural areas. They controlled land, money, and often, fear. To many of these groups, outsiders were suspicious. Even dangerous. Even if they came in peace. Still, Terence, Ingrid, and Lahe'ena'e believed in their mission. Every day, they worked with the community, writing, teaching, planning. They walked the trails with children, helped carry water from the stream, learned the names of trees, the meanings of dreams. In one of his final journal entries, Terence wrote, "It is hard work. But it is the kind that makes your hands stronger and your heart softer. These people trust us with something sacred. We must be careful. We must be honest. We must be brave." The days passed quietly. But not without tension. News came that roads near the village were being watched. There were whispers of patrols, of strangers asking questions. Some nights, dogs barked into the darkness, and people lay awake, listening for footsteps that never came. But the work continued. They believed time was on their side. They believed truth was enough. They believed they were safe. None of them knew that soon, their mission of peace would take a dark turn. That the rainforest, once their shelter, would become the setting of something tragic. That the world would soon hear their names not in celebration, but in mourning. The UWA territory stretched far and wide, dense green hills rolling into deep valleys, and rivers running like silver ribbons through the earth. Mist hung low over the trees each morning, softening the shapes of the rainforest. It was a living, breathing place. The UWA called it sacred. Here, the air felt different. Humid and heavy with the scent of wet leaves, bark, and flowers, it clung to the skin like a second layer. The sounds never stopped: birds calling, frogs croaking, wind stirring the canopy. Everything felt alive, awake. Terence, Ingrid, and Lahe'ena'e arrived not with loud voices, but with quiet presence. They were guests in this world, and they knew it. They sat in long circles with elders, listening more than speaking. They watched the children play with sticks shaped like animals. They shared meals of yucca and corn by firelight. They respected every word, every silence. Their work was not about giving orders. It was about helping the UWA speak in their own way, on their own terms. The team supported the creation of a school system, one that taught math and writing, but also UWA language, music, farming, and the stories passed down from ancestors. They believed that protecting land also meant protecting memory, identity, and voice. Lahe'ena'e often walked with UWA women, asking questions with care. She understood that women carried the knowledge of families and seasons. She smiled when she spoke, and her laughter was gentle but firm. She said that Indigenous women around the world shared a quiet power, one passed from grandmother to mother to child. Ingrid, too, felt at home. She sat in hammocks and listened for hours, recording stories, drawing family trees, helping elders map the songs of the land. Her notebook was always open. She understood the value of memory. She believed in honoring culture not just in books, but in action. And Terence, he never stopped asking how to help without harming. He was aware of his identity, his history, his role. He cleaned dishes. He fetched water. He learned how to sit still. He once said, "I'm here to protect what already works. I'm not here to fix anything." The UWA noticed this. They respected him because he respected them. But outside the rainforest, pressure was building. For years, oil companies had looked at the UWA land like a prize. Beneath the sacred earth were reserves of crude oil, black liquid that could power cars, planes, and industries. It was valuable. Too valuable. Exploration permits had been granted. Helicopters had hovered overhead. Engineers had visited. And each time, the UWA resisted. Peacefully, but firmly. Their land was not for sale. It was not a resource, it was a relative. The presence of foreign allies like Terence, Ingrid, and Lahe'ena'e gave the UWA strength. But it also attracted attention. Outsiders noticed the growing support. The message was spreading, that the rainforest was not empty land, and that Indigenous people were not alone. Still, the visitors believed in hope. They believed in the power of peaceful work, of education, of listening. In their journals, they wrote of the trees, the music, the resilience of the UWA people. They stayed longer than planned. The trust was growing. One evening, near the end of February, the rain began to fall softly. It tapped on the leaves, slow and rhythmic. A group gathered in a circle around a small fire, UWA elders, children, and the 3 visitors. They spoke of planting new seeds in the next season. They spoke of building stronger schools, recording more oral histories. Laughter floated into the trees. Ingrid looked up at the stars breaking through the clouds and whispered that she hadn't seen a night so beautiful in years. Lahe'ena'e hummed a tune from home, something her mother used to sing. Terence was quiet, holding a carved piece of wood given to him by a young boy earlier that day. In that moment, everything felt in balance. Earth, sky, past, future. But peace, in this land, was fragile. The next day, the visitors prepared to leave. Their mission, for now, was complete. They had plans to return soon with more materials, more letters of support from around the world. They packed their journals, their cameras, and their gifts from the UWA. They said goodbye with soft words and long hugs. The forest watched as they stepped onto a narrow trail that would take them toward the town of Saravina. They did not know that the trail ahead was watched, too. As Terence, Ingrid, and Lahe'ena'e walked the narrow trail out of the UWA territory, the rainforest seemed to hold its breath. The air was thick, humid, heavy with the smell of wet earth and moss. The thick canopy above filtered the sunlight into green shadows that danced with every gentle breeze. But beyond the natural beauty, an unseen tension hung in the air like a silent warning. The presence of armed groups, hidden in the dense forest, was a constant threat. Colombia was in the midst of a long and painful internal conflict. Guerrilla groups like the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC, operated in the region. They claimed to fight for justice, but their methods often caused fear and uncertainty for everyone in their path. For the UWA people and their allies, this meant walking a dangerous line. The rainforest was their home but also a place of hidden dangers. Terence had noticed unusual signs during the journey: broken branches where no animal should have passed, the distant crack of a twig under heavy boots, the eerie silence where birds suddenly stopped singing. He wrote in his journal, "The jungle holds many secrets. Some, I hope, will never be revealed." One morning, as the sun pushed through the fog, the group was stopped. Figures emerged from the shadows, members of the guerrilla group. Their faces were hidden beneath scarves and hats, their eyes sharp and cautious. They spoke with harsh voices, questioning the visitors' purpose in the forest. Terence tried to explain the peaceful mission, the work with the UWA to protect their land and culture. But suspicion lingered in the air. The guerrillas were wary. Oil companies were powerful players, and some had accused the guerrilla groups of involvement or at least tolerance in exchange for control of the territory. It was a tangled web, one where outsiders often found themselves caught in the middle. The visitors were told they must leave. The message was clear and unspoken. Your presence here is dangerous. Despite the warning, the 3 advocates hoped to continue their work. They believed in dialogue and peace. But the forest that had once felt like a sanctuary was now shadowed by distrust and fear. As the sun set each day, Terence, Ingrid, and Lahe'ena'e gathered in quiet corners, speaking softly of what they had seen and heard. They understood the risks, but they also understood the importance of their mission. The land they fought for was not just soil and trees. It was memory, identity, hope. They believed that even in the darkest moments, truth could be a light. But that truth would not be easy to tell. The forest continued to watch. The winds whispered warnings. The shadows grew longer. The Colombian rainforest stretched endlessly around them, an immense sea of green, full of life yet heavy with silence. The towering trees reached toward the sky like ancient guardians, their thick trunks wrapped in vines and moss. The humid air was alive with sounds, the distant call of colorful birds, the gentle rustling of leaves stirred by invisible creatures, and the quiet drip of water falling from leaves after a brief but heavy rain. But beneath the beauty, the forest held a heavy secret. Terence Freitas, Ingrid Washinawatok, and Lahe'ena'e Gay were no strangers to danger. Each had faced challenges in their work for indigenous rights and environmental protection. Yet nothing had prepared them for the deep, unspoken weight that settled over the UWA territory, a place where courage was met by fear, and hope was tangled with uncertainty. Days after their encounter with the guerrilla fighters, the three advocates found themselves moving cautiously through narrow paths. The undergrowth was thick, making every step slow and deliberate. Their clothes were damp with sweat, mixed with the dirt and the smell of the rainforest itself, a scent both comforting and oppressive. The canopy above blocked much of the sunlight, turning the forest floor into a mosaic of shadow and light. Here and there, shafts of golden sun broke through, illuminating bright green leaves and delicate orchids clinging to tree trunks. The air was cool in these patches, a brief relief from the humidity that clung to their skin. Terence paused, pulling out his small notebook to jot down his thoughts. He wrote about the strange mix of feelings inside him: awe at the forest's beauty, sadness for the pain it hid, and anger at the forces threatening the land and its people. He reflected on the complexity of the conflict, a war fought not only with weapons but with greed, silence, and broken promises. Ingrid, always observant, noticed the quiet tension in the group. She felt the heaviness of history around them, the stories of her own ancestors in the Menominee Nation, who had fought to protect their land from destruction. She knew the pain of loss, the frustration of voices ignored. Lahe'ena'e, with her calm determination, focused on the strength of the UWA community. She admired their resilience, their deep connection to the land, and their refusal to give in despite the threats that loomed. She understood the importance of their work to preserve not just the rainforest, but a way of life. But danger was never far away. One evening, as the sky darkened and the cicadas began their nightly chorus, the group set up a small camp. They built a fire to chase away the biting insects and shared a simple meal of rice and beans wrapped in leaves. The flames flickered, casting shadows that danced on the faces of the weary travelers. The forest night was alive with sounds: distant howls of animals, the rustle of creatures moving unseen through the underbrush, and the low hum of insects. Yet beneath these natural noises was another sound: the quiet, watchful presence of eyes hidden in the darkness. Terence spoke softly, breaking the silence. He shared a letter he had written but never sent, addressed to his partner Abby. In the letter, he expressed his fears about the growing support some guerrilla fighters gave to oil exploration, a betrayal that made his mission even more dangerous. His words were raw and honest: "I feel the shadows closing in. It's not just the oil companies anymore. It's those who should protect the land, but instead threaten it." Ingrid listened, her eyes reflecting the firelight. She understood the deep conflict, fighting for justice in a world where allies could become enemies. Lahe'ena'e reached out, placing a hand gently on Terence's shoulder, a silent promise of support. That night, sleep came fitfully. The forest's sounds became sharper, more alert. Every crack of a twig made hearts race. The weight of silence was heavier than ever. The next morning brought no relief. The sky was gray, thick clouds threatening rain. The path ahead was muddy and slippery, making each step a careful effort. The group moved slowly, eyes scanning the trees and bushes, aware that danger might strike at any moment. As they crossed a small stream, Terence knelt to drink from the clear, cold water. He looked up at the canopy, where the leaves shimmered with droplets from the recent rain. The forest was alive, but the danger was real. Ingrid took out a small carved wooden figure, a gift from the UWA elders symbolizing protection and resilience. She held it tightly, a talisman against fear. Lahe'ena'e hummed a soft chant in Hawaiian, a prayer for strength and guidance. The three found comfort in these small rituals, reminders that they were part of something larger than themselves. but their peace was shattered. Suddenly, the sound of distant voices reached their ears, rough, urgent. They froze. The voices grew louder, accompanied by the heavy steps of boots crushing leaves and twigs. The guerrilla fighters were nearby. Terence quickly gathered his journal and supplies. Ingrid and Lahe'ena'e stayed close. They knew they were vulnerable. The voices stopped just beyond the trees. A tense silence followed. Then came the command, harsh, cold. The three were ordered to surrender. Bound and blindfolded, they were led through the dense forest. The rough hands of their captors contrasted with the softness of the leaves brushing their faces. Every sound was amplified: the crunch of leaves, the distant call of a bird, the steady beat of their own hearts. Hours passed like days. They were moved from one place to another, always under guard, always unsure of what awaited them. In the quiet moments, Terence held on to hope. He whispered words of encouragement to Ingrid and Lahe'ena'e, reminding them of their mission and their strength. They clung to their shared belief that truth and justice would one day prevail. But the rainforest held its secrets close. And the journey for justice was just beginning. The days following the capture felt like a slow unraveling of time itself. Bound and blindfolded, Terence, Ingrid, and Lahe'ena'e were held in silence, the dense jungle around them seeming to close in tighter with each passing hour. The usual vibrant sounds of the forest, the calls of toucans and the rustling of leaves, faded into the background, replaced by the heavy, suffocating quiet of captivity. The air was thick with humidity, making each breath feel heavier than the last. Drops of water from the recent rain dripped steadily from the broad leaves above, creating a rhythm that marked their endless wait. In this endless silence, memories became their refuge. Terence remembered the vibrant mornings in Los Angeles before he left, the golden light filtering through his apartment window, the distant hum of city life mingled with birdsong. He thought of Abby's warm smile and the quiet moments they shared, filled with hope and dreams for justice. Those memories were both comforting and cruel reminders of a life suddenly so far away. Ingrid's thoughts traveled to the crisp air of Wisconsin, to the familiar forests of the Menominee Nation. She remembered the sound of her grandmother's voice teaching her ancient stories, the taste of wild berries picked fresh from the earth, and the steady strength of her people's traditions. Even in the darkness, those memories gave her a sense of belonging and purpose. Lahe'ena'e recalled the vast blue of the Hawaiian sky, the gentle sway of palm trees, and the soft crashing of waves on coral reefs. Her mind played over the songs her grandmother sang, songs of resilience, of strength, and of the unbreakable bond between land and people. Those songs felt like a lifeline in the shadows. Yet, even in their memories, a shadow lingered, the shadow of fear and uncertainty. Not just for themselves, but for the UWA people whose land they had come to protect. The rainforest was alive with whispers of machines cutting through trees, of oil rigs threatening sacred grounds. The quiet resistance of the UWA seemed fragile against the loud roar of industrial machines, and that silence carried a heavy weight. Far from the dense trees and tangled vines, Abby Reyes sat thousands of miles away in her small apartment, the soft light of a single lamp illuminating a worn letter clutched in her hands. It was an invitation, a call to participate in Colombia's transitional justice process, to demand truth and accountability. The letter's arrival was unexpected, and it reopened old wounds that had never fully healed. She traced her fingers over the faded ink, remembering the day Terence left for Colombia, his eyes full of determination, his heart set on making a difference. They had shared dreams of justice, peace, and a world where Indigenous voices could be heard. Now, 2 decades later, the letter was a fragile thread connecting past pain to a hopeful, uncertain future. The Colombian government's promise of justice was slow, tangled in legal complexities and the difficult process of healing a nation torn by conflict. The transitional justice system was a delicate dance between former combatants, victims, and those seeking answers. For families like Abby's, it was a chance of fragile hope to finally hear voices long silenced. Meanwhile, the UWA people continued their quiet resistance beneath the vast canopy of the rainforest. Elders gathered around fires, their faces etched with years of struggle and resilience. They spoke softly in their native tongue, sharing stories of the land, of spirits that protected their forests, and of ancestors who had lived in harmony with nature for centuries. Their words were a reminder to younger generations of their sacred duty to protect their home against forces that sought to exploit it. Children ran along narrow forest paths, their laughter ringing out like bright bells among the towering trees. They splashed in clear streams, unaware of the battles waged around them for their future. The rainforest breathed around them, vibrant, alive, yet fragile. Terence's journal, discovered after his death, became a beacon for those left behind. His unspoken words echoed through the pages, fears, hopes, and warnings penned in moments of solitude. One entry stood out, filled with a quiet urgency: they want to take more than land. They want to take our voice, our story. His words were a reminder that the fight was not only physical, but also a struggle to keep the truth alive. This truth, buried deep in the shadows of the rainforest, was now beginning to surface, carried by those who refused to forget. As the years passed, the Colombian rainforest remained a place of both beauty and danger. Towering trees stretched their branches toward the sky, filtering sunlight into soft, green beams that danced over the forest floor. The air smelled of rich earth and fresh rain, but beneath this serene surface, tension simmered. The UWA people, guardians of this land for centuries, faced relentless pressure. Oil companies, backed by powerful interests, sought to open the forest to drilling, a threat that could change everything. Roads were built, machinery roared, and the quiet life of the rainforest trembled under the weight of progress and greed. For Terence, Ingrid, and Lahe'ena'e, the mission was clear: stand with the UWA, amplify their voices, protect the sacred land. But the opposition was fierce and sometimes invisible, hidden behind political deals and shadowy negotiations. Despite the danger, the three activists remained committed. They met with UWA elders under the shade of ancient trees, listening carefully to stories passed down through generations, stories of creation, survival, and the sacred bond between people and earth. These gatherings were filled with quiet dignity, a strength born from deep respect and shared purpose. Ingrid took careful notes, documenting the cultural knowledge that the UWA hoped to preserve for future generations. Her experience as a leader in Indigenous advocacy gave her a unique perspective. She knew that culture and identity were as vital as the land itself. Lahe'ena'e worked closely with women in the community, helping to develop programs that honored Indigenous traditions while offering new tools for empowerment. Her gentle voice carried encouragement and hope, inspiring many to believe that their culture could survive even the greatest challenges. Terence's days were filled with field work, sometimes trekking through muddy trails under heavy rain, other times mapping the lands threatened by extraction. He carried a small notebook everywhere, jotting down observations, sketches of plant life, and thoughts on how to best support the community. Despite the hardship, there were moments of joy. At night, around crackling fires, UWA songs filled the air, weaving the past and present into a tapestry of sound. Children danced under starlit skies, their laughter ringing out over the quiet hum of insects and the distant calls of howler monkeys. But shadows loomed. The presence of armed groups in the region added a constant undercurrent of fear. Roads and trails that once seemed safe became dangerous passages. Whispers of threats against those who stood in the way of oil exploration spread quietly but with growing urgency. Terence sensed this danger keenly. He wrote in his journal about growing tensions and fears for his safety and that of his companions. The once clear mission now carried a heavy weight: the risk of violence and loss. Meanwhile, back home in Los Angeles and Hawaii, Abby and other loved ones waited anxiously, hoping for news, clinging to the belief that justice and peace could prevail. In Colombia, the struggle of the UWA and their allies became part of a larger story: a country wrestling with decades of conflict, seeking paths to peace, truth, and reconciliation. The transitional justice process promised a chance for voices long silenced to be heard, but the path was complex and often slow. Families of victims faced years of uncertainty, their search for answers a painful journey through legal and political challenges. Despite these obstacles, the legacy of Terence, Ingrid, and Lahe'ena'e lived on, inspiring others to continue the fight for justice, protection of the environment, and respect for indigenous rights. The rainforest, with all its vibrant life and fragile beauty, stood as a silent witness holding the stories of those who fought, loved, and dreamed beneath its canopy. Many years had passed since Terence, Ingrid, and Lahe'ena'e last walked through the rainforest. But for Abby Reyes, the journey had not ended. She carried the weight of memory, of unfinished questions, and of love left in silence. One quiet afternoon, Abby sat in her small study, surrounded by books, papers, and the gentle ticking of a clock. Light poured through the window, falling on a single cardboard box. It was marked with old handwriting, faded ink, a little torn at the corners. This was the box. The one she had saved for years, full of documents she wasn't ready to face. Inside were news articles, court documents, post-it notes with scribbles, and letters, so many letters. It was like a time capsule of sorrow and strength. Abby reached inside and pulled out a small, folded paper. It was Terence's handwriting. A letter he had written during his last visit to Colombia. A letter he never sent. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it. "I don't know if I'll give you this," Terence had written. "But I need to let these thoughts out so I can sleep." His words were raw and honest. He talked about his fears, the sense that something was wrong. That maybe the danger they all felt was real. He believed that the armed groups might no longer support the people, but instead the oil development threatening the rainforest. Abby had read this letter before. Or at least, she thought she had. But somehow, it felt different now, like a forgotten voice calling out from the past. It filled her with sadness, but also clarity. She called her legal team in a rush, fearing she had uncovered something new. But they gently reminded her they already had this letter. It was part of the case. She had shared it years ago. But her mind had hidden it away, protecting her from pain she wasn't ready to face. Now, as she reread it, something shifted. The fog in her heart began to lift. "These words," she whispered. "He wrote them to rest. And maybe, now, I can too." Abby closed her eyes. The soft rustle of leaves outside the window filled the room. The fight had been long, but not forgotten. And in telling this story, in giving voice to what was lost, she found peace. Justice had not yet come in full. The process was slow, the answers incomplete. But truth had been spoken. Names had been remembered. Love had been honored. And somewhere, deep in the rainforest, the trees still whispered the names of Terence, Ingrid, and Lahe'ena'e, not as victims, but as guardians of a dream that had not died. If this story moved you, even just a little, we ask you to help keep their memory alive. Please like this video, share it with someone who cares, and subscribe to follow more stories of quiet courage and justice. Every voice matters. And sometimes, the quietest ones speak the loudest.